The structure of the A deduction is not terribly clear, and explicitly Kant has told us that section 2 is sort of preparatory, and then section 3 is going to contain the argument. Well, maybe it does, but it is, I would say, not necessarily that much clearer what the argument is in section 3 than it was in section 2, although I hope that by now we have a pretty good grasp of what Kant is trying to achieve and how he is trying to achieve it. Anyway, in section 3, Kant is going to tell us that if we want to really understand all of this, right, if we want to see how all of this works, what we have to do is we've got to start at the top, so to speak. We've got to start at this point of the transcendental apperception. Here's what Kant writes, and I'm at A116. All intuitions are nothing for us, and do not in the least concern us. And us here is us as cognizers, us as people interested in achieving knowledge, right? They do not in the least concern us if they cannot be taken up into consciousness, whether they influence it directly or indirectly, and through this alone is cognition possible. We are conscious a priori of the thoroughgoing identity of ourselves with regard to all representations that can ever belong to our cognition, as a necessary condition of the possibility of all representation. This principle holds a priori and can be called the transcendental principle of the unity of all the manifold of our representations. Right? And then Kant has this footnote in which he tells us that the synthetic proposition that every different empirical consciousness must be combined into a single self-consciousness is the absolutely first and synthetic principle of our thinking in general. Okay, this is the absolutely first and synthetic principle of our thinking in general. It is this unity. Everything that appears in empirical consciousness has to be related to our one single transcendental consciousness, if that's what you want to call it. It is all one, and we have to recognize it as one, and we have to take it up into this same attempt at cognition, into this same attempt at knowledge, into this process of comparing and finding coherence, right, as it was described to us in section 2. Okay, now that's where we start, right? This is the fundamental principle. Well, maybe something is presupposed by this. And if something is presupposed by this, a priori certainty, then that must be an a priori certainty too. So we get to A118. This synthetic unity, however, presupposes a synthesis, or includes it. Presupposes or includes, right? Kant doesn't really want to say that the one is earlier than the other. I mean, it's all sort of equiprimordial, to use a nice word. It's sort of equally fundamental, equiprimordial. It presupposes a synthesis or includes it, and if the former is to be necessary a priori, then the latter must also be a synthesis a priori. Okay, like the manifold that is given in empirical intuition has got to be taken together. Right? It's got to be brought together. There's got to be this synthesis if there is this synthetic principle of the unity of consciousness. And that synthesis is a priori. Thus, the transcendental unity of apperception is related to the pure synthesis of the imagination as an a priori condition of the possibility of all composition of the manifold in a cognition. But only the productive synthesis of the imagination can take place a priori, and so the principle of the necessary unity of the pure productive synthesis of the imagination prior to apperception is thus the ground of the possibility of all cognition, especially that of experience. Okay, the productive synthesis of the imagination, the ability of our mind to posit together, to posit in one representation different representational elements. That is an absolutely necessary precondition for the unity of consciousness. In fact, everything that we find in empirical consciousness has to be able to be brought together. It's got to be posited as belonging together. And as I understand it, that is the task of sort of the a priori task of the productive synthesis of the imagination. It posits everything that is sort of all the elements of experience as belonging together in various ways, right? Those various ways gonna turn out to be basically the categories. The unity of apperception in relation to the synthesis of the imagination is the understanding. Okay, this is our first redescription of the understanding in this section, because later on, Kant is going to tell us that we can now characterize the understanding as the faculty of rules. Right? So Kant is using the opportunity to explain to us a bit more what the understanding is. The unity of apperception in relation to the synthesis of the imagination is the understanding. So it is this positing of everything together under rules that is the understanding. And this very same unity in relation to the transcendental synthesis of the imagination is the pure understanding. Right? If this happens a priori, it is the pure understanding. In the understanding, there are therefore pure a priori cognitions that contain the necessary unity of the pure synthesis of the imagination in regard to all possible appearances, and these are, of course, just the categories. That is, the pure concepts of the understanding. Nice. It follows that the pure understanding by means of the categories is a formal and synthetic principle of all experiences, and that appearances have a necessary relation to the understanding. Okay. So that is sort of basically what Kant was trying to do, right? Telling us that the categories have a necessary, the categories apply to all experiences, and that appearances have a necessary relation to the understanding. That was the basic aim. Okay, what do we have then? Since every appearance, and I'm at A120 now, since every appearance contains a manifold, thus different perceptions by themselves are encountered dispersed and separate in the mind, a combination of them, which they cannot have in sense itself, is therefore necessary. We are now going to think a little bit further about the implications of what we just said for the relation between the understanding and sensibility. Right? Because sensibility, sense, isn't going to give us the kind of thing of which what we just said can be true. So we're going to push things a little bit further. Therefore, there must be an active faculty of the synthesis of this manifold in us, which we call imagination, and whose action exercised immediately upon perceptions I call apprehension. For the imagination is to bring the manifold of intuition into an image. It must therefore antecedently take up the impressions into its activity, that is, apprehend them. But even this apprehension of the manifold alone would bring forth no image and no connection of the impressions, were there not a subjective ground for calling back a perception, and that's why we're going to need the reproductive faculty of the imagination. Right, so what we're seeing here is that Kant is sort of revisiting his threefold synthesis. Right, okay. In order for anything to, actually appear to our self-consciousness, it's got to fit in the understanding, it's got to fit under the categories. Let's push that a little bit further. What does that mean for sensibility? Well, sensibility is just this loose collection of stuff. That's not good enough. It needs to be apprehended, it needs to be brought into an image. So we need to be able to sort of get it together, but also we need to be able to reproduce the elements that would otherwise disappear, that are not present in our experience right now. Right? We need to be able to bring that back in order to get this whole, this image. So that's why we need the reproductive faculty of the imagination. However, if representations reproduced one another without distinction, just as they fell together, there would in turn be no determinate connection, but merely unruly heaps of them, and no cognition at all would arise. If this just happens in a haphazard way, we still don't have the right thing for the categories to apply to. So we're still not there. We know that more has to happen. Because again, we know a priori that all experience is gonna, have this categorical structure. But so far, what we see sensibility to have doesn't have a categorical structure, is not the right thing to have a categorical structure. So their reproduction must have a rule in accordance with which a representation enters into combination in the imagination with one representation rather than with another. This subjective and empirical ground of reproduction in accordance with rules is called the association of representations. So still, we're now moving on from sensibility towards the understanding. Okay, there's got to be some rules, some associations where like the taste and the sight of sugar always go together, or the knocking on the door and the appearance of my wife always go together, and so on and so forth. But that's still just subjective, right? Now, if this unity of association did not also have an objective ground, so that it would be impossible for appearances to be apprehended by the imagination otherwise than under the condition of a possible synthetic unity of this apprehension, then it would also be entirely contingent whether appearances fit into a connection of human cognitions. If there were no objective ground, then it would be just a matter of chance whether our empirical ability to associate things together could ever get started, right? Whether there would ever be anything that could, be brought together by association in accordance with a rule. Okay, so let's back up a little bit to see once more what Kant is doing. Right, the beginning of section 3 tells us that it is an a priori certainty that there is this unity of self-consciousness. Right, that is like the basic principle, we know it. But it can only be there if there is this synthetic unity of experiences that can be grasped by the understanding. Right, that's what the first part of the section has done for us. We know this. This is certain. This is a priori. That is Kant's claim. So now what Kant is doing, he is thinking about how we can get from sensibility to the kind of stuff that has to be there if this a priori certain stuff is true. Well, this a priori certain stuff is true because it's a priori certain. So whatever we're going to find, that sensibility, that has to be done to sensibility, or that has to be required of whatever is given in sensibility, in order to fit with these a priori certainties, must be true as well, and must in fact be a priori and certain as well. So, sensibility, it's loose and separate. We need something more. Okay, we need the reproductive faculty of the imagination, because it can associate things together, and it's got to succeed at associating them together. But this success can't be merely empirical. It's got to be certain and a priori. How could it be certain and a priori? Well, it can only be certain and a priori if it is not contingent that this stuff, that whatever is given to us in intuition, can be put together according to rules. And so Kant tells us, and I'm at A122, there must therefore be an objective ground, that is, one that can be understood a priori to all empirical laws of the imagination, on which rests the possibility, indeed even the necessity, of a law extending through all appearances. A law, namely, for regarding them throughout as data of sense that are associable in themselves and subject to universal laws of a thoroughgoing connection in reproduction. And I call this objective ground of all association of appearances their affinity. Okay, there must be something, there must be an objective ground of the associability, the affinity of all appearances. Right? And again, this is clear, it follows from Kant's story. So if we believe that Kant is right, then this follows. The objective unity of all empirical consciousness in one consciousness is thus the necessary condition even of all possible perception, and the affinity of all appearances is a necessary consequence of a synthesis in the imagination that is grounded a priori on rules. And so the imagination is also a faculty of a synthesis a priori, on account of which we give it the name of productive imagination. Okay. Now, Kant is going to insist that this productive imagination then again has to be linked up with the I, with the subject, the transcendental subject, the fundamental apperception. It must be added to the pure imagination, and this is A124, in order to make its function intellectual. For in itself the synthesis of the imagination, although exercised a priori, is nevertheless always sensible, for it combines the manifold only as it appears in intuition, that is, the shape of a triangle. Through the relation of the manifold to the unity of apperception, however, concepts that belong to the understanding can come about, but only by means of the imagination in relation to the sensible intuition. Okay, so again, Kant is telling us that it is the unity of this subject that allows us to bring everything finally together under rules and give it a sort of conceptual nature. Okay, that's the story. And starting from the possibility of of cognition, starting from the possibility of grasping objects, all of this is supposed to follow. Or really, starting from the a priori certainty of the unity of self-consciousness, all of this is supposed to follow. Okay, we might believe that, we might not believe that, but that's the Kantian story here in the A Deduction. And now Kant is going to tell us, like, he's going to draw some of his fun and, for a non-transcendental idealist, extreme sounding claims. So at A125, Kant says, thus we ourselves bring into the appearances that order and regularity in them that we call nature. And moreover, we would not be able to find it there if we, or the nature of our mind, had not originally put it there. Right? So whatever is given to us in intuition, what comes from outside, and that is in a sense sort of the content of the empirical. Right? What comes as the content of the empirical, that's nice, but it wouldn't even be the right kind of thing if it had not been taken up in the synthesis of the imagination into this pure a priori unity of self-consciousness. If it hadn't been taken up into that, it would not even be a possible object for cognition. And in being taken up, we necessarily and a priori give it the shape of a lawful, ordered world. And that lawfulness, that order, is what Kant calls nature. And so it is we ourselves who bring into the appearances nature. And we would not be able to find it there if we, or the nature of our mind, had not originally put it there. Right? And so it turns out that the understanding is the faculty of rules, and as Kant says somewhere, maybe not here, the lawgiver of nature. Alright, that's what I want to say about the A deduction. Next time, we're going to delve into the B deduction. Because as I said, Kant was apparently a bit unsatisfied with how he explained things here, and he rewrote section 2 and 3 for the second edition, and that is known as the B deduction.